What do I mean by transforming loss? That's a great question. Everyone that I've spoken to recently in the last few weeks, honestly, since COVID started in March, um, has expressed an enormous amount of sadness and loss. Sometimes this is a very obvious experience. People are losing loved ones. They've lost jobs. We've lost a way of life, a way that we celebrate and commemorate life events. Work life has changed. Working remotely in my life, teaching has changed. Even the workshops that I do, I can't meet with people face to face, which is just a wonderful experience. Going to the bookstore, getting your coffee, browsing around, coming to the workshop, hanging around and talking after. I mean, we've taken so much for granted, and now we've lost that. We've lost those connections, even just hugging people. So on every level, we are experiencing a tremendous amount of grief and loss in our lives. And I describe a loss and grief experiences, these events, like a spider web, like a spider's web. Across the course of our experience, we have a series of losses from early childhood to the current moment that we're experiencing right now. Some of us have immense trauma and loss. We lost parents when we were young, or a brother or sister, maybe a child later on in our life. But just a series of grief events that kind of shape our lives and the way we then respond to grief and loss in the current situation. And what Transforming Loss, the workshop, is about is looking at that web, looking at these grief experiences, and carefully acknowledging the role they've played in our lives. And we can use stories, various fiction, myths, sacred text. We can look at stories and gain from them some information about what is this experience that seems so tragic and senseless in our lives. And that is what the transformation that is promised in those stories is extended to us in our experience. And those of us who have survived immense loss and grief know that you come through on the other side with the ability to empathize, with a certain wisdom. You carry a certain knowledge, a certain inner knowledge about that experience that you then are able to share with others. And that's what I mean by transforming loss, and just looking at that process. And wherever you happen to be in your own journey, your grief experience, you can look at that and say, maybe that holds some benefit for me as well. Maybe there's something there that I can learn. Maybe there's a piece of information that I can hold on just to get me through. And so there's a lot of potential in this catalyst of grief and loss that I'm trying to mine for some meaning making, to be frank. So that's what I mean by transforming loss. Is this a grief support group? No, it is not a grief support group. It's a different kind of model. I have to say that even though I've experienced a series of losses, I have never attended a grief support group. I can't speak to that specifically, but what I'm focused on in Transforming Loss as a workshop is, again, looking at a series of stories that explore grief as a process. In the first story that we would look at, it's talking about the descent, where we really are laid bare and opened up to just to complete disintegration, in a sense. And anyone who's experienced tremendous loss knows what I'm talking about. You feel as if you've been obliterated. And so we look at that story and then say, what happens in the story? What happens in the story? And how does that translate into what's happening to me? And so that is what we do in the workshop. And there's a collective experience that happens when people come together. It's a small group. It really needs to be limited, because that work is very intimate. We hold a kind of a kind of space that needs to be very to honor the experience of each person in their own grief events and the web of their grief. And so Transforming Loss as a workshop is a collaborative experience of hope and humor and honesty, and it's a beautiful thing. It's a really beautiful thing. Yes, it was my own personal experience that brought me to this place in my life, and I have my own grief events, but not to belabor that point. But it was the most recent severe grief event when I saw my son, who has schizophrenia, for the first time in 6 years, and my son is in his 30s. He lived often on the street for a time. I did not know where he was for many months at a time. But seeing him for the first time in 6 years at the state hospital was such a traumatic experience. I didn't expect to be so completely laid bare by this encounter with my son, who was in a completely dysregulated state. And so in that moment, all I could do was start to write about that experience. And the only way that I could make sense of what was happening and allow myself to let go of my dreams for my relationship with my son as I wanted it to be, my ideas of the way I wanted his life to be, and my hopes for him, I really had to let go of all of that. And it was that grief event, that tremendous loss. And not only that, but anyone who has an experience loving someone with mental illness also knows that that is a grief and loss that you carry, that it continues to happen over and over again. It's not one time. It's like a loss, and then you have hope, and you think maybe things will change. Maybe you can do something that'll be different. Maybe this time the medication will work. Maybe this time this program will work. Only to go through the process again, only to feel let down by a system that is also another source of tremendous grief and loss. And so in that experience, I took what was happening, I wrote it down, and it was the process of writing it that really allowed me to access these stories. It was the stories, the myths and stories that I found myself drawn to. Sometimes spontaneously, sometimes almost in a kind of a serendipitous way. I would find myself drawn to a story, and then I would find, there's a meaning here for me. There's a message here for me on how I can survive this unbelievable pain, and through those stories and through the writing of living grief, I found that I could find joy in my life, that I found my way toward a fulfilled life that wasn't completely identified with the grief story and the grief event, but that took that and integrated it and allowed me to move through it and to find the benefit from it, the ability to empathize, the ability to sit quietly with others while they were really experiencing some of the most tragic moments of their lives, and the ability to have compassion. And so there's a lot to be said for this grief experience and what it brings to us, and the stories hold the key. And so if there's anything that I can say about grief and loss and transformation, I think it is one of the most profound catalysts for personal growth and development. And we're all going to experience on some level. As you see now, everyone's experiencing small, large, any number of amounts of grief and loss. So I hope that you'll come and explore this endeavor with me and look at these stories and see how they relate to your experience and your web of grief, and you can also access the transformative power of the grief event and the losses in your life. So join us.